Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here and making this work. It's a privilege to be together, to learn together in general. It's on days like this and subject matter like this and with a group like this that I'm reminded by what one of my professors said in seminary, saying the command to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might or mind, depending on what you're reading. He said in antiquity, when that was written, they didn't understand neurology in the brain and all that. They thought the heart was the thinking organ. So you are loving the Lord with all your heart as you come to learn and wrestle with theology and scripture and ethics and all those things. That just the act of education is a spiritual practice. And I'm so deeply grateful that you're here. We are going to cover the pastor and hero and martyr and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer over the next 2 weeks. We're going to discuss a little bit of his youth and his career, but also really discuss the context that he was in, the development and rise of Nazism in Germany, and the church's response, varied response, unfortunately. And so today we're covering half of that, and next week at this same time and in this same place, we'll cap off his story. So with that, I also, and I know that like self-deprecating humor can get to a point of being its own form of narcissism. So like I get that, but so this is not like aggrandizing myself here. This is really to speak to the gift that is Dr. Hammerling or Pastor Roy. Is, I thought of this a number of times, and I warned the adult education team this, like they wanted us to co-teach together. And it's almost like asking like a third grader in Kobe Bryant to teach basketball. Like I'm Kobe. I'm pretty confident, but then you run into people like Roy who just have such a gift of teaching, and the historian that he is. It's a true privilege to learn and teach with him here in the room. So without further ado, we'll get right after it. Just a note of citing sources here. Any photos that you see on the slides today, these images will come from either Wikipedia or the Holocaust Museum's website. So we just wanted to source those images. And if they're not, the individual image will have a source in and of itself.
Did we have?
Oh, say that again?
Do we have?
Oh no,
okay.
That's the one thing we forgot.
Yeah.
Next week, we will give you a timeline just to refresh you, but also there's a lot of dates coming at you, and sometimes it can be hard to organize your thoughts. And I was supposed to remember to print off a lot of timelines for you, and I failed. So, but next week, I'll try not to make that same mistake, because it is really helpful to have a timeline in front of you. But we'll do our best today, and you can raise your hand and stop us at any time and be like, where are we again? Okay? So here's a couple pictures of Dietrich Bonhoeffer himself in adulthood, but again, just sourcing those images and leading you to that. So we're going to start at the beginning. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born in 1906 to Paula von Hasse and Karl Bonhoeffer. And just an interesting note about each of his parents, because I think understanding his parents and their lineage does help you understand Bonhoeffer a little bit with greater depth. For instance, Paula's grandfather, so if we go back up, mom, her grandfather, so Dietrich's great-grandfather, was a chaplain to the Prussian ruler and Prussian court. And he was fired for advocating for the poor, for saying that the Prussian leadership was not doing enough to serve the vulnerable. And I can't tell you how ironic that is, because at this time in history, the Prussian leadership and Prussian royalty and nobility boisterously bragged about how Christian they were. They were often telling the intellectual community or atheist or agnostic community that was rising up, or any critiques of Christianity, the Prussian leadership was quick to try to silence those voices. So the church was, the Prussian government was constantly trying to proclaim this Christian identity. And then the irony that then when they're called on it, by actually being Christian to take care of the poor, they silence that voice as well. So on one hand, we're saying, his great-grandfather is already part of this lineage of challenging power, right? Like Bonhoeffer comes from that type of family and lineage. But not only that, I paint this because, or I emphasize this because it's important as we learn Bonhoeffer's story that there is a habit of governments in history co-opting the Christian identity, but not actually following through with Christian ethics. And so I think Bonhoeffer's story, his lineage, even down to his great-grandfather, should remind us to be suspicious whenever we see governments do that, political leaders do that. That, our dog Iggy is a wild child. And like when anything from a plastic bag to an actual animal goes across the window that she can see out of, her hackles come up and she starts psychotically barking at whatever it is. And I look at Iggy and those hackles come up, right? This like defense and nervousness, and she prepares. I think our Lutheran hackles need to come up. And I think we'll learn that through Bonhoeffer. Whenever we hear and see political figures and governments co-opt Christianity, all right? That's going to be a running theme throughout his life. So with that, we now get to his dad. His dad was a renowned neurologist and psychologist. And so not only are they a politically involved family, they're also a very scientifically minded family. In fact, they weren't even that religious of a family. It's said that they seldom even went to church. So it does come as a surprise later on that Bonhoeffer would go on to study theology. Here is a picture of Dietrich and his twin sister Sabina. And this would be, but again, he was born in 1906, just again to place his timeline a little bit. He was the sixth of 8 children. And this is actually little Dietrich right here. Pretty wild, yeah. Just pulling on your heartstrings a little bit.
Just to say something interesting is notice that, in German families, I don't know if Betty's here but if you go back, he's dressed in a dress, right? He's got long hair, looks like a little girl. But that was Dietrich, yeah. So it's kind of, there's only 7 of the 8 here. Yeah.
Right. And so the Bonhoeffer family in 1912, so Dietrich's about 6 years old, they moved to Berlin, right? This cultural and political center in Germany. And so much of his childhood is spent growing up in Berlin. Here's a picture of their home in 1916.
You can still visit it today.
You can still visit it today, says Roy. And one tragic thing that happened, the oldest brother of Dietrich, Walter Bonhoeffer, did volunteer to fight in World War I and tragically was killed in action at 18 years old. And Dietrich would have been around 12 or 13 at that time. And then at the age of 14, Bonhoeffer decides to study theology. I think I was just learning to tie my shoes at 14. But I think when we think of activists, sometimes what's underplayed is their intellectual prowess. And I think that's the reason one of the reasons we're emphasizing that Bonhoeffer, his life and story and discipleship was incredibly inspiring and courageous. And we also have to make no mistake that he is one of the most gifted intellectuals in Europe at the time. He was a notable theologian. And to be studying theology at 14, again, this surprised the family quite a bit because they seldom went to church. But this is a photo of him in 1923, so he'd be about 17 years old in this photo, which is a notable age because at 17 years old, Bonhoeffer would begin to attend university at Tübingen University. He'd attend there from 1923 to 1927, so from 17 to 21 years old. But he'd finish his dissertation and PhD by 21. So again, a deeply gifted intellectual. And his dissertation was on that article in the Creed, the communion of the saints. And he talked about, as one of his main arguments in that dissertation, and this is important because he dies on this thesis. later, right? He lives and dies on this thesis that he develops in the dissertation in the Communion of Saints. He makes an argument among many, makes an argument that Christianity as a spirituality is not merely an individualist spirituality. It's not just about personal relationship with Jesus. It's not just about personal salvation. It is fully matured in community. It is fully, our spirituality is fully enacted in community. And again, that's further developed later on in the late 1930s in a landmark book that he writes called Life Together. But again, even at 21, he's formulating these deep theological thoughts, and he'll live and die on these thoughts. And just notably, Karl Barth has a huge influence. Was he a teacher too?
Yeah.
Bonhoeffer direct? Okay.
He wasn't a direct teacher, but Barth is probably he's one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. He wasn't Bonhoeffer's direct teacher, but he was a very close friend of his. Just to put him in a little more context, Barth will have to leave Germany because of the Nazis. He will attack Nazi ideology and thought, and he will have to flee to Switzerland. But they remain friends throughout their life. Yeah.
And so Barth, I remember one of my systematic theology professors in seminary saying, Karl Barth is arguably the greatest, most impactful European theologian in the 20th century. And so he's a titan in theological scholarship. And he took a look at Bonhoeffer's dissertation at 21 years old and called it a theological miracle. And I can't overstate again what that means coming from Karl Barth, who is himself a theological miracle. That again is how gifted of a theologian, scholar, and intellectual that Bonhoeffer was. That the gold standard of the day was pointing to his work and calling it a miracle. Later on in 1928, and how old would he be then? By 22 years old, he does leave the academy, so to speak, for the parish. He takes an assistant pastorate in Barcelona, Spain at 22. But by the time he is 23 years old, he becomes an assistant professor at Berlin University. And what's notable about becoming a professor at Berlin University is to achieve his PhD, he had to write that dissertation on the Communion of Saints, right? Well, to get a professorship here at Berlin University, he has to actually complete a second dissertation, and it's called On Act and Being. And so by the time he's 23 years old, he's written 2 dissertations. And by 1933, he's about 27 years old. He is fully ordained, becomes fully ordained in Berlin. And here's just sort of an iconic photo. As you come across Bonhoeffer in his life, this is an iconic photo of Bonhoeffer and his confirmation students. With that, I'm just going to kind of more fully turn it over to Kobe here. It should be the right side that you click to turn it.
Well,
Left side, excuse me.
When we were asked to do the class, I said I really wanted to teach with Joe. You could see why, right? Because of his enthusiasm, his love for Bonhoeffer. And I said, we can do 2 things. You can talk about Bonhoeffer, and I'll talk about the historical context. And I want to talk about the historical context in a couple ways. First of all, Bonhoeffer is one of the most important theologians, I think, in a modern setting. And we're going to get into that much more next week. We're going to talk about, we're focusing mostly on history and Bonhoeffer's life in order to make sense out of what his ideas and thoughts really were. And my family, as I've noted in some sermons and things, were in Nazi Germany in the 40s. So they're not there quite yet. They're German Russians. They're living in just north of the Black Sea by Odessa, which is now modern day Ukraine, which is still a problem right today. And so they would eventually move here. So I'll talk more about my family experience then. But let me put the context of Bonhoeffer's life into a little bit more of a setting. So Bonhoeffer, as you can see, is an extremely gifted young man. I think the death of his older brother, Walter, in particular, had a tremendous effect on him. He was trying to figure out how to make sense of the world, how to make sense of how the world was operating. They have just come out of World War I. Remember, he's born in 1906, World War I, 1914, 1918. And Bonhoeffer is trying to figure out in his gut, in his deepest heart, what's wrong with the world, right? And how many of you have had that feeling? And I have that feeling today. We keep wondering, well, how do we get ourselves into this? Aren't we smarter? We're in the 21st century. Shouldn't we be taking care of all the problems of the world? And we seem to just get into them deeper and deeper. What are some of the issues that are going on in Bonhoeffer's background in his life? Well, first of all, when Germany lost World War I, they were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles put all sorts of restrictions in Germany, such as they can only have a military that was very, very small so that they couldn't rise up again and start another war. How did that work out? But the Germans became very resentful of that. Germany goes into a tremendous economic crisis, and they're moving out of moving into kind of becoming an early democracy. They were a monarchy. They move into this democracy. It's a very fragile democracy. It's a parliamentary system. And as they're moving into this democracy, various parties start developing. And there were all sorts of right wing, left wing. There were communists the Communist Party was popular in Germany at the time, as it was in the United States. We a lot of times forget that. And then you had nationalist parties, not only the Social Democrats, the Nazi Party was developing at that time, but also there was other parties that were developing that were right-wing at that time. And as this political situation is splintering, one of the things that we kind of forget is because they can't have a military, these various political parties started developing militia groups, started developing their own military powers within their own groups to kind of protect themselves. And so the Nazis had the SA, and they developed the Römer develops this military power. And as there's all these sorts of political tensions, you can see this, right? If you have your own military groups in your own political party, they're eventually going to start running into trouble. And so Hitler comes along, and Hitler was not a German citizen. He was from Austria. In World War I, he joins the German army as an Austrian. He's still not a citizen. He becomes a corporal in the German army. And there's this one very ironic situation that comes up. Hitler is fighting, and he falls into a trench with a British soldier. And the British soldier and him are fighting it out. And the British soldier gets the best of it. He's ready to kill Hitler. And the British soldier decides, okay, I'm going to let this go. I'm going to let him survive. And later on, Hitler will invite this British soldier back to Germany later on to honor him when he becomes chancellor. And there's a little movie on that. If you want to know any of this sort of stuff more, just send me an email, and we'll send you the outline of the timeline or what these other movies are and things. So in any case, ironic, there's a lot of irony with Hitler, but he comes back, and it's interesting. He can't even become a citizen until 1932 when he wants to participate in the elections, because he cannot participate in elections if he's not a citizen. So he has to renounce his Austrian citizenship. He's been in politics for about 13 years at this time, and he starts developing this party platform. And there's two things that he builds on. He builds on the idea of creating chaos within the political system, trying to cause the various factions to fight against each other, and also, therefore, appealing to German nationalism. He said that the Treaty of Versailles was a disgrace, and he wants to move forward from that and get the German people back to their rightful, quote-unquote, status in the world. Well, this is going to affect the church. So you can see in this picture, for example, we have stormtroopers at St. Mary's Lutheran Church in Berlin that would stand outside and promote, would use tactics to promote their own Christian nationalism at the time. And the Christian nationalism of the time they called their theology positive Christianity. That was the name that they used. And it was a mixture of Nazi ideology with Christian nationalism. So what we see when in the 1930s, in 1930, the trouble inside Germany is that the people are very discouraged with the political system. They barely have enough to eat. They have all sorts of economic troubles. They're barely having enough places to live and all sorts of difficulties. So that sort of economic situation lends itself towards people moving towards extremes, either the left or to the right, and that's what we see. But in 1930, the Nazi Party jumps up to 107 seats in parliament, and eventually will win about 37% of the 51% needed in parliament in order to rule the government. And that was the most that they would ever win. So notice the Nazi Party never, ever really had a majority in Germany. And that's something that we tend to forget. And so the Nazi Party jumps to these seats, but Hitler has the most seats in parliament. So he now has the political clout to be able to move things forward. And what we see is when there was this fighting between these various political groups, I mean, they were literally going into each other's homes and killing each other. And Hindenburg, who was the chancellor, the leader in England, in Germany, Hindenburg finally allows for a law that says if anybody kills somebody else, we have the death penalty for that. And everybody was mad. What? A death penalty for us killing people? Why? That's crazy. But in any case, that's what happened. What was interesting, by the time you get into the early 30s, much of the legal system is very sympathetic to the political right nationalist parties. So that when they came up for it, having killed some people, they usually got off. But if the communists killed somebody, they usually got killed. But there was an instance in which 5 Nazis had killed another political party member from a different group, and they were sentenced to death. And boy, this caused all sorts of political trials and troubles. There's a really great book out right now called The Takeover. It's a wonderful historical breakdown of how Hitler comes to power, and I recommend it to you. I'm just finishing it myself as coming back to this. So anyway, Hitler becomes a German citizen in 1932. He becomes a chancellor in 1933, partially because he's got enough political clout and enough of the parliament that he says, listen, if I'm not made chancellor, I'm going to throw this whole thing into chaos. We will vote against everything that the government wants. We don't care about the common good. We're just going to bring the system down. Hitler even says, we have the tools within the democratic system to bring it to its knees. We're just going to tear it apart. And so Hindenburg, who's in his 80s, a giant of a man who's been a really important part of German history, finally lets Hitler become chancellor. And in 1933, that was January 30th, Bonhoeffer goes on the radio and denounces him. He says, we have leaders who have become misleaders, people who no longer speak the truth but tell us lies about how people should be treated within Germany, that there are certain people that are better than others, Aryans, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. It's called social Darwinism and eugenics, and talk about how certain people are inferior. In fact, some people are vermin, some people are rats, such as African Americans, Africans, Jews, Gypsies at the time, Roma, and others. These people are subhuman, and they must be treated as such. And in order for Germany to reach its heights, we will deal with people who are homosexual, and so on and so forth. January 30th, Hitler becomes chancellor. January 31st, Bonhoeffer goes on the radio and is cut off mid broadcast. He is the first person to denounce Hitler publicly, and one of the only ones to have the courage to do it early on. And in fact, a lot of other pastors and people at that time said to him, you're going too far. You shouldn't really speak out against Hitler at this point. Bonhoeffer was the only one who did it. February 27th, we're going to have
Sign say. The banner.
the sign said,
The banner.
oh, this one?
Yeah.
Wählt Liste Deutsche Christen. Vote for the German Christians, the German Christian movement. So they were actually advocating for, I'm having a problem here.
Oh, you're right. I think I told you the wrong one. So
Okay.
get you set up here, and then you just click this side.
Okay.
There you go. There you go.
So there's a lot of pressure to move within the church now. A number of people, as you can imagine, if you have now about 40% of people in the churches voting with the Nazi party, they start putting pressure on the churches to support this party. And even the Catholic Church, Pope Pius XII, has to sign an agreement, a concordat between Catholics and the Nazis because they're worried about losing power. They actually think Hitler's going to be okay because Hitler was Catholic. And they think he's going to go along with them. So they actually decide to sign this in agreement with him. And of course, he didn't care about anything religious unless it promoted Nazi ideologies. And so they signed the Concordat, which meant basically that Catholics can't run for political office, but that the Catholics could still allow themselves. They were a formidable political party in Germany at that time. And so Hitler kind of, this is one of the great victories for Hitler early on, marginalizing some of his enemies. Hitler becomes chancellor. Look at Hindenburg. I mean, this guy's a monster of a guy, isn't he? He's a big military general. And look at all the things on his chest, and then Hitler having to kind of bow to him. But what happens shortly after, notice I said January 30th. Now we're already not quite a month into his office. The Reichstag building burns. The Reichstag is the parliamentary building, or like the White House. Not the White House, but where our parliament, where our government is in the Capitol building. Capitol building, which is brand new, burns to the ground. A guy named Marinus van der Lubbe is a 24-year-old, mentally disturbed young man, a part of the Communist Party. He's accused of setting the fire. He's quickly tried, and he's quickly put to death. What's interesting is people don't often know is that Karl Bonhoeffer is one of the guys he is the psychiatrist who checks him out to say that he can stand for trial. Interestingly enough. So Bonhoeffer's father is connected to this man. Most historians now will say that he probably had nothing or little to do with the fire. And he was pardoned by the German government in 2007, Marius van der Lubbe. But what happened was, what was that?
A little late.
It was a little late. Marius van der Lubbe, what's important about this is that Hitler, because of this event, declares martial law and will not release martial law until after the war. So he gains control over the government and never loses it. After that, all those supposed political elections, which they win by landslides, ballot boxes are just stuffed, right? You know, it's all fiction. The Gestapo is established just right after that. We need a military group. We have the militia that Hitler has already established, just turns them into the Gestapo. Dachau concentration camp is open. If you're going to start having political prisons, you need to put them somewhere. So they put that, Arbeit macht frei, of course, the great phrase, which later becomes for Jews, you know, you work and you will be set free. Terrible, terrible. Dietrich and Sabine, one of the things that happens to Dietrich is that Sabine marries a man who's Jewish, a man by the name of Leopold. Her father-in-law, Sabine's father-in-law, dies, and they ask Bonhoeffer to do the funeral. He goes to church authorities, and they won't let him do it. And he decides not to. Later, Bonhoeffer will say, I don't know why I didn't have the courage to do that. You know, there are historically, the Jews there's an organization called Vash Hashem, and they pick people that are are non-Jewish who are righteous. They're accepted, like Oskar Schindler, right? They say they're a righteous Gentile who helped the Jews. Bonhoeffer is not one of them. Even though later on we'll see that Bonhoeffer actually helped some Jews escape. Well, that'll be next time. he's never become a part of that because of incidents like this. Early on, he didn't really stand out, particularly against the civil laws which developed, the anti-Semitic legislations that developed from 1933 to 1939, which basically takes away citizenships from Jews, no longer allows Jews to come in, also takes citizenships away from political prisoners and a variety of other things. And Jews are now forced to wear Jewish stars, eventually are put into ghettos, and so on and so forth. We could go into this for a long time. One of those laws was that the brown shirts, a lot of the soldiers from Hitler's group would ban businesses, Jewish businesses, and they would set soldiers in front of the businesses and wouldn't allow people to go inside the businesses because the concern, they were trying to drive them out of business, drive the Jews out of Germany. Julie Toffel, who is Bonhoeffer's grandmother, crossed the lines. She was in her 90s. She would walk through the soldiers, say, "Get out of my way. I'm going to buy my stuff from my Jewish friends." So we see once again the women in Bonhoeffer's family, as Joe pointed out earlier, are the ones that showed him the way of resistance. Ludwig Miller becomes, they actually established what's called the Reichschurch. It's a Protestant church which promotes Nazi ideology, positive Christianity. Ludwig Miller becomes the first the bishop of that church. And you can see that what's important about, you have all these religiously inclined people, but you have the Nazi insignia set up as a part of the German National Church or German nationalism. Other things that happened right away was Jewish books and other books that were considered subversive, that didn't promote Nazi ideology, are now burned. They have these burning parties that would go on. And even Luther, this is on the 450th anniversary of Luther's treatise on the Jews and their lies. Luther wrote a treatise called On the Jews and Their Lies, in which he basically advocates for anti-Semitic attitudes at the end of his life. This German phrase reads, Hitler's Kampf und Luthers Lehre, des deutsches Volkes gute Wehr. Hitler's struggles, Mein Kampf, Hitler's struggles, and Luther's teachings, the German people will make good. Oh, does that hurt a little bit? Yeah. Right? Luther is picked up as the model through which, if you read Mein Kampf, Hitler becomes important to. Hitler looks to Luther as his model, especially the anti-Semitic writings later in Luther's life. Eventually, a group called the Pastors' Emergency League develops, which is an attempt to be Protestants who fight over and against the German Nationalist Church, which is starting to take over the Protestant churches. Martin Niemöller is really important in that. And we're going to talk about this all a lot more next time. But right now, we're going to show you, if you want to watch the best documentary film, and there's a lot of bad ones out there, but one that's really good is by Martin Doblmeier. He's got a documentary just simply called Bonhoeffer. And we're going to show you a little segment of that film right now, which goes and talks about what happened to Bonhoeffer. Now he's got his dissertation, he's writing, he's a pastor, and he wins a fellowship to come to the United States. And in the United States, he has some very important things that happen to him and that shape his life. We're going to watch this, and then we're going to leave this open for questions. And then next time we'll come back and finish Bonhoeffer's life. I'm going to go a lot more into detail about the Nazi church next time.
And apologies about just structuring sound. We're still probably experimenting with it. I'm going to try not to blow these people out of the water. But this is our speaker here, and I've got closed captions best I can here. And I'm going to gradually turn it up and hopefully not ruin your whole week. All right? Maybe. Oh, Paul, what do you think? It's not being.
While they're trying to get it. So Bonhoeffer wins this fellowship to Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And he's going to go there to do two things, study and to teach, because he has his PhD, but he's also going to study with some very important people.
All right, take two.
Is their sister living in England during this time now? Is she safe? His sister?
His family is all in Germany.
Yeah.
His sister, Sabine, will go to England at one point.
We are, yeah.
What's that?
It's pretty informative.
Yeah, yeah, that's not what you want to learn about today. I was pulling up something on YouTube in one of my classes, and one of these crazy videos came up, and my students were just thought, oh yeah, that was perfect, Hammerling. I said, you got to learn about everything, you know, we're not hiding any truth from you. But yeah, Sabine and her husband would eventually, I can't remember who asked the question, Sabine and her husband would eventually have to go to England, but most of his family would stay.
Perfect. That's perfect. Yep. Thank you.
And remember, 1929 is the Great Depression, and that adds.
Came to New York on a teaching fellowship to Union Theological Seminary in Upper Manhattan. Initially, Bonhoeffer was disturbed by the casual classroom style, which was very different from the more rigid German approach. At Union, he studied under Reinhold Niebuhr, who often used the work of contemporary Black writers to teach theology.
Reinhold Niebuhr is considered by many to be the father of social ethics in this country. He achieved fame because of the way he was able to criticize the social ills of the United States, offer practical solutions. Therefore, it's surprising when we read in Bonhoeffer's journal that he didn't like Reinhold Niebuhr. What he found lacking was the Christocentrism that he had come to admire in Karl Barth, and that, of course, became the centerpiece of his own writings at this time. But later, a lot of what Niebuhr was driving at came to enter into Bonhoeffer's own way of thinking, that the purpose of theology, the purpose of ethics, is to change this world for the better.
At Union Seminary, Bonhoeffer began a friendship with Franklin Fisher, one of Union's few Black students. Fisher introduced Bonhoeffer to Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church. It was unlike anything Bonhoeffer had ever experienced.
I know the Lord laid his hands on me. Oh, I know the Lord. I know the Lord. I know the Lord laid his hands on me.
It was a large, impressive stone building which had in its membership great pride that this was not a building worn out by white people and then sold to blacks. It was a building which they built for themselves. And it was just as big and just as impressive as any building that any white church had ever built. They had the best of preaching. A man like Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was a towering giant in the pulpit, as well as a physically towering giant with a mane of gray hair.
At Abyssinian, Bonhoeffer discovered a community encouraged by Powell to be emotional in the expression of their faith, and he witnessed for the first time the political and social engagement of a church.
Powell reflected the fact that throughout its history, the black church, the black pulpit had social conscience. So here was a man of considerable intelligence, and training, a man of real passion, solid biblical commitment, who was also involved in the social issues of his time, political issues of his time.
Bonhoeffer wrote home to his family.
I have had the chance to hear the gospel preached in black churches. Here, one can truly speak in
Bonhoeffer also wrote that in America, blacks sing before audiences of whites who applaud them wildly, yet still deny them equal rights. Over the next months, Bonhoeffer taught Sunday school in Harlem, and he bought recordings of his favorite spirituals.
Apparently, he did not come across as a kind of arrogant, paternalistic, know-it-all kind of guy, but someone who was eager to learn and humbled by the experience about what he did not fully understand, recognizing that there was something quite profound at work in the church.
Bonhoeffer began a friendship with another Union student that marked his life. Jean Lasserre was a deeply committed pacifist, and in the post-World War I era, when friendships between French and Germans were rare, the two became close. Lasserre told Bonhoeffer, "Nothing in scriptures gives a Christian the right to destroy the body of Christ."
The simple reading of the Sermon on the Mount compels one who is sincere to refuse to take part in the war, because almost everything a man does in warfare is contrary to the gospel and to the ethics of the gospel. And the drama is that for centuries the churches have said, well, but on the level of the country and defending the country, the gospel ethics is suspended. We are authorized not to respect it. And that was the point of our discussion.
I suppose if you had to ask people about what is Christianity all about, some would say it's putting into practice what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. The question then is, well, how does one love one's enemy? What does it mean that blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the earth? And those kinds of things. What does all this mean? In traditional German Lutheranism, the Sermon on the Mount was so impossible for anybody to keep that the way in which it was handled traditionally was to say that Sermon on the Mount made us aware of how sinful we are because we just can't do any of that. Lasserre helps Bonhoeffer to understand that the Sermon on the Mount isn't simply something to make us feel sinful, something to put into practice. Now, this stayed with Bonhoeffer from that time onwards, which was quite a fresh thought that Jesus actually intended us to live like this.
While in America, Bonhoeffer read accounts of the mounting economic crisis in Germany.
And so Bonhoeffer, after this experience in the United States, will go back to Germany. But one of the things that is important to notice, Bonhoeffer becomes a pacifist, and he is against war. He wants to go meet Gandhi. He studies for a while as a pastor in London, and here's Bonhoeffer in New York City with Franklin Fisher and Jean Lasserre as part of the class. Union was very unusual in that it allowed African American students with white students at the time, right? And now you have a French student. French and Germans didn't get along; they just fought a war, right? World War I. And so the fact that Lasserre and Bonhoeffer become friends, and Bonhoeffer is now, his ideas are beginning to take shape, and he's realizing that we need to change the world. We have to figure out how to stop war. We have to find a way to find that we can love one another. And his experience in New York was extremely influential on his thinking. But now he's going to go back and he's going to get into the middle of it, just as Nazi Germany is starting to take over and as the country is falling apart. And remember, at the Reichstag fire, essentially what happens after that, Germany has become a fascist state because the elections no longer are free and easy. lots of people are excluded from elections. Lots of laws are made so that certain people can't vote. Jews can't vote, and so on and so forth. And then eventually their property is taken away and various other things. So now let's see, how are we doing on time? I got it.
I think we could comfortably go another 9 minutes.
Okay, 9 minutes.
Or so.
Joe has a job. I'm retired a second time. So Joe has to get out there. But we thought we'd leave some moments, some time for discussion because we're throwing a lot at you. Next time we'll have the timeline that'll help a little bit. I also have a number of books up here in the front that will come important, but these are just books. This is just about the church under Nazi Germany. It's kind of the definitive 800-page volume thing. And we'll talk more about some of those things, but I have Bonhoeffer's writings and other things like that up here. But so what sorts of questions do you have or thoughts, or we're going to pull this all together next time because I'm going to explain how there's what's going to call the confessing church, which emerges out of the Pastors Emergency League. That's going to develop. And how that develops in Germany and how the pastors start to try to resist Hitler and what happens. It's not actually a very happy story. It's a pretty sad story. Most of the German pastors wind up supporting Hitler rather than resisting him. Out of about 17,000 pastors, only 3,000 pastors joined the confessing church, and most of those will eventually give up as well. So it's a sad story, but we'll talk more about how that comes about next time. So any questions? Yeah.
That burning of the Reichstag, was that ever traced back to Hitler?
There's a lot of theories about that, but yeah, so a lot of people do think that, there was some involvement, that was kind of a catalyst. You create a crisis, you create martial law. There was law number 46 or something. When he was chancellor, he had the right to call for martial law, and then once he called it, because of that, he never withdrew it. He kept his power.
How did Bonhoeffer support himself? How did he?
Well, he was supported by teaching and also as a pastor. He had various jobs throughout that. His family was very wealthy, so he never went without. His family would have supported him, even though there was 8 kids. She was kind of out of that. She was out of some sort of nobility, out of the Prussian nobility, obviously, with the chaplain, and his dad was a very wealthy psychiatrist. But when he needed money, his family was there to support him. But he made his own money through teaching, and later on he'll be. It's ironic. This is for next time. He makes his money teaching and preaching, but when he's forbidden to teach anymore and to write, he'll have a brother-in-law who works in what's called the Abwehr, which is like our CIA intelligence, and he'll hire Bonhoeffer to keep Bonhoeffer out of the draft. And we're going to see that it has huge implications because Bonhoeffer then will be involved in the plot to kill Hitler. And he'll do that through the Abwehr.
That large picture that you had of probably 50 guys in it. What picture? What was that? Where were they?
Oh, that's at Union Theological Seminary, this one. That's when Bonhoeffer is teaching and studying at Union Theological Seminary.
Okay. So those are Union Theological Seminary.
Some of these are students, Franklin Fisher, Jean Lasserre, and then the faculty in the back.
Is this Niebuhr?
Niebuhr, yeah. Looks like Niebuhr.
Yeah.
Or everybody else.
Terry, thank you so much for setting this up, by the way. We appreciate it.
First of all, I want